So today we're going to focus on the process of transforming your academic CV into a more skills-focused resume, a resume that can be used for a wide variety of different industries and fields, but that, as you'll see, is a sort of an iterative work in progress. Whilst you may feel that there's a final CV that you have and it looks the same, in a matter of speaking, no matter how you use it, the resume is a much more flexible document that requires a little bit more nuance when it comes to putting together narratives that work for your audience. It's really about your audience as opposed to, your CV sometimes feels like it's just about you. This is who I am right now, but the resume is who you are to a certain type of audience out there. So we'll touch on a few of these aspects as we go through this. I'm Dr. Joseph Barber. I'm the Director of Graduate Career Initiatives here at Penn Career Services. You all are very familiar with a CV, obviously. You probably all have one or look at it on a regular basis or don't like it, or you've seen your advisors and it's 15 pages long. The CV is not a dynamic document in terms of what it tries to present. It is not a narrative document. If you look at it, it doesn't actually tell a story through your words. It sort of paints a picture of where you've been and who you've done things with and what you've said and what you've published, but there's no sort of narrative about that. So, it can be this really long document that just keeps being added to and on and on and on and on. More is not necessarily better in many cases for anyone's CV, but just because it dilutes some of the main takeaways that you're trying to get across if it's spread across 15 pages or whatever that looks like. So on the right here is just an example of a typical CV that you might see. It's sort of, again, the education and the research are forefronted in terms of what that looks like. Many people will have a single version of their CV when they're applying for faculty positions. I often recommend that you can customize it in subtle ways, but that's a question or a topic for another day, as it were. So again, just two different styles here. These look like both Humanities CVs that I've chosen here. One sort of just focuses on the outcomes, the publication. One talks a little bit more about the dissertation and integrates that into its own section so people can see the nature of the research. Because in an academic CV, your research obviously wants to be at the forefront in many cases, or your teaching, so that jumps out from the page. But here's the challenge, right? So if you're looking at this sample of the CV on the left-hand side, can you answer any of the questions in general terms that I posted on the right-hand side, right? So just looking at this, do you know if this person is actually a good collaborator, or if they are innovative, or if they can solve problems, or if they're good at managing people or resources? Are they a good communicator, right? So publications, yes, they are a form of communication, but are they broad? Can they speak to a broad audience? The fact that you may be a co-author, does that mean that you can actually collaborate? Or were you working in two separate silos and then brought together just to sort of make the sort of publication come to life? Is the research even innovative? Is it cutting edge? If you're not in that field, it's hard to say, right? So because there are no words that describe these skill sets that I'm sort of listing on the right, it's hard to picture those just by looking at the CV itself. And that's going to be the challenge when it comes to looking at jobs in the sort of the expanded realm of careers that are out there, is that people are looking for skills and they're looking for knowledge and they're looking for experiences. And the academic CV is not really good at demonstrating any of those in sort of illustrative ways. The dissertation sort of section, if you've been doing research for a long time, then you're very much integrated into, this is my research, this is my narrative about my research. That is often forefronted in these academic CVs. And if you look at the way that people describe their research, right, oftentimes it's not about you as much as it's about the chapter or the dissertation or the project, right? So sometimes people give away their power to this non-corporeal entity as they're describing it, which is hard because, as you are on the job market, it's you, not your dissertation, that people are going to want to hire. So giving this power to the dissertation isn't always the best approach. And then these are some of the skills that come from describing research like this. I examine, I trace, I analyze, I seek to highlight, and especially in the humanities and social sciences, I argue, right? It's a very common academic word, argue, but it's actually not something you'll ever see in a job description where someone says, what we need is someone who can really argue a lot, right? That's not what they're looking for. Now, they're looking for people to add different perspectives, but framing it as arguing isn't necessarily going to be, a sort of a positive way of doing that. So again, another description here of research that is this dissertation, this study, right? This study argues or explores, not I explore, but this study does, right? So in a resume, you really need to shift from the it does this to I can do this, right? And really make you the main character here. This dissertation sets into motion a critical reappraisal, right? So all of this language is perfectly appropriate for the academic setting. I'm not in any means sort of minimizing the impact of the way that these are described, because they are aligned with how they should be for a faculty role, but they are not aligned for the majority of other roles that exist out there that you might be interested in, right? That language does not translate over. And if we look at some of the jobs that are out there, and I try to pick some jobs that, these aren't necessarily entry-level roles by any means, but they're sort of roles that sort of value, in this case, sort of a humanities background, we can see some of the skills that they're actually asking for, right? We need someone who can coordinate resources and personnel. We need someone who can maintain the database and develop strategies, ideas, and collaborations, right? These are much more dynamic descriptions of skills that are out there in these job descriptions. We need someone who can manage staff, who can manage performance and workflow, who can establish systems, who can develop reports, right? And if you think about this language versus the way that, you know, one might describe a dissertation or the dissertation research, it's very distinct. Now, the skills that you're actually using in both cases are much the same, but the language used to describe them is very different. And that's going to be important too. So again, another example, creating and managing a budget, cultivation, leverage resources, nurture and motivate volunteers, right? So again, all of these things, if you are a TA and you're working with students, you've done some of these things, but the language that the job sort of uses is that language that eventually that you'll want to be using too. Long-term planning, fiscal leadership, again, this is a more advanced position. Experiment with emerging technologies and keep pace with new thinking on digital interpretation. So this idea of being innovative, creative, is built into the research that you're doing. Your research is innovative in its own way. Oftentimes, though, people don't necessarily describe it in that way when they're sort of transforming that research experience into a more, into a resume style approach. Now, this is sort of a STEM version of an academic CV, again, just to illustrate some of the challenges that are out there. So in this case, you know, the research is highlighted by the publications. So you have the publications there, and first experimental and theoretical demonstration of nanoparticles, first experimental demonstration of three-dimensional metamaterial. So it's a description of what the research is, but it doesn't necessarily connect the person whose CV it is with that research, with doing that, right? So you're sort of saying this thing happened or this thing was found, but not I was integral to finding those things. So same sort of challenges that exist out there. Here's an engineering one, has a research experience section here. And the first sort of statement, the first few words after that bullet point aren't skills focused, right? Demand response management of repeated non-cooperative Bayesian games, network optimization with heuristic. They're not stated in a I did this kind of way. Now, later on, it gets closer to that. But a lot of these descriptions are about the nature of the research, not the skills used to do the research. And unless you are going into a role where your research context, the context of your research directly maps onto the thing that you'll be doing next, then part of the process of transforming your CV to a resume is about making sure that your language is the appropriate language, for your audience. So let's think about some of the skills that come from, STEM type roles: lead matrix product teams, interface, collaborate with stakeholders, use quality by design principles, provide mentorship. Again, mentorship is a thing that you do at Penn all the time. So that's an easy one to sort of to integrate in there. Involved in matrix leadership. A lot of jargon here that you need to understand, but that also needs to begin to be part of your narrative in your resume. Lead research, right? Rather than just saying this research happened or this was the outcome of the research, you have to frame it in many cases as I can lead this project, right? It's not just research, it's project management, it's project leadership, right? So there are lots of ways to redefine some of the things that you're doing to make sure that those skills come to life. So then the resume is a skills-focused document, right? Primarily, it's about illustrating how you've used relevant skills in different experiences. And those relevant skills are all about your audience, about the job that you're applying for. And so what's relevant for one application will be different from what's relevant from another application in many cases. Even if you're applying in the same field or the same industry, the nature of the role will be subtly different, that you can manipulate some of your experiences to make sure that you're highlighting the things that your audience cares most about. And right at the bottom, some of the challenges that people do face with resumes is that you do have to use different language. You can't use the same language that you're describing your research to advisor to sort of apply for a position that your advisor isn't part of, as it were. So you need to make sure that that language is adaptable. And you also need to be comfortable with the idea that you're going to recreate versions of yourself for every application, right? So, and that's okay, right? It's okay to have different versions of yourself or different narratives about yourself for different roles, because you are a complicated being, a complex, complicated, multifaceted, multi-skilled being, and you can be different versions of yourself where needed. And so that's okay. And it's actually quite engaging to go through this process of reimagining how your skills and knowledge can fit different roles that are out there. So hopefully what we'll do today gives you some confidence about what that looks like. In the CV, these are the standard sort of sections that you might find. In a resume, you could get away with just having, you know, your contact information, your education, a relevant experience section, relevant to the role that you're applying to, and maybe a skills section, right? That's all you really need. Other things you can add to it for sure. And sometimes what you'll end up creating is sort of a hybrid resume and CV, where it sort of follows some of the structure of the CV, but is much more skills descriptive going through that. But a resume is a much more targeted, focused document. Things that aren't relevant to your audience don't need to be included, right? It doesn't mean that you didn't do those things. When you say I have relevant experience, you are just giving them what is relevant to them. You are not talking about all the things that aren't relevant, because what you're trying to do is not dilute your narrative, right? So if you include everything that you've ever done and someone has to read through all of that, then the things that are most relevant get diluted and get harder to see from the reader's perspective. So again, very flexible. It can look different. Different industries, different career fields sort of have different preferences for what these documents look like. But in many cases, you know, these sort of 4 sections are all you really need to do moving forward. So let's go through our sort of 10 areas to focus on as we're thinking about these documents in terms of you know, making sure that that resume works for you. Resumes do not need to be a single page. In some fields, they prioritize that. So in consulting, they may, but if you have an advanced degree, many consulting firms will take a version of an academic CV. I would not send them your academic CV because it really doesn't illustrate all your skills. But what it means is that they're comfortable with the idea that someone with an advanced degree has a complicated, you know, research and teaching background, and you know that doesn't always fit nicely into one page. But in many cases, a one-page version is going to be the best summary of who you are. But for industry, for example, you're going into a biotech or biopharma, a 2 to 3 page resume, perfectly fine, because you're also going to have your list of publications in many cases and your list of skills that they're looking for, and that takes up a lot of space. Whether it's 1 page or whether it's 3 pages for a resume, prioritizing the information so that the most relevant, impactful information comes in the first half or in the first page is going to be important. So prioritizing that to make sure that the reader immediately is satisfied that you have some of the skills that they're looking for. That's why some people in a resume have a summary of qualifications section at the top, which is sort of the conclusions of the resume that you want the reader to walk away with, so that even, you know, if they don't get to the 3rd page, they already have from the 1st page everything that they need to know that you have value that you can bring to that role. So you know, that summary of qualifications can be a very helpful way of just making sure that you are inputting your takeaways into the mind of the reader right at the get-go moving forward. It's not an essential category, but it can be helpful to really frame up some of that experience. As I said, so that these conclusions, they're helpful, but they have to be echoed by something in the main part of the resume. So whether you call it research experience or relevant experience or professional experience, you have some flexibility there. If you say in the summary of qualifications that you are an innovative leader, for example, you can't just say it there and not say it anywhere else. So it has to be illustrated in action what that looks like as part of your relevant experience, where you may have said, you know, led a new team to develop this thing that resulted in something great happening. So just like in a scientific paper, in many cases, your conclusions have to be supported by the evidence. Same is true with the summary of qualifications here. Skills are something that many people don't necessarily include in an academic CV, primarily because, you know, they think, well, I must have these skills if I'm doing this research, right? If I've published 3 papers, obviously I have these skills. And that may be the case, but in a resume, you really do want to highlight skills, technical skills, and make sure that people know that you have these skills. Don't make any assumptions, because they may not know about your research or what you've done that research. So the skills section is a sort of a list of skills, oftentimes broken down by sections, you know, software or databases or whatever it is that you do. And then the most important skills that are sort of valuable to the employers that you're applying to can also be illustrated in that relevant experience section. So you're listing them in the skills section, you're showing them in action in the relevant experience section. And that's a better way of demonstrating your proficiency in those skills than just having a skills section where you might say, SPSS proficient, because proficient means different things to different people. But if you can show how you've used it in the experience, then that's a really great way of illustrating that in action. Contact information, so it's a small part, but it's an important part, right? So if you are a postdoc, then having your PhD after your name obviously is, that's one of the reasons that I got a PhD, is so that I could use the title because I thought it would be fancy. So putting it after your name is important, but it's important also because if you're a postdoc, probably the first section that you're going to list in your resume isn't your education section, right? Because that's not the most recent version of you. You might list relevant experience, and you being a postdoc may be part of that. So making sure that the PhD comes after your name signifies right from the get-go that you have the PhD. Obviously, we'll say postdoc too, but that's a great way of doing that. If you are a PhD student, obviously you're just waiting for your graduation to be able to stick that up there. But it's a great way of signifying that you have this skill set. Now, most of the roles that you'll be applying for will value the PhD. And people sometimes have the question about, well, if they don't ask for a PhD, is it helpful? Should I include or not include it in my header? Should I de-emphasize it to a certain extent? That's a personal sort of conversation to have with yourself. I've always valued in any role that I had, even if it doesn't require a PhD per se, demonstrating that the expertise that I have, or the knowledge, or the skills, or the research, or the maturity that I feel like goes along with the PhD. So I feel like in many cases, or the doctoral degree that you have, I feel like in many cases you should always include it, because they're going to find out from your resume that you have it anyway. And so leaning into it, I don't think is ever a negative. In an interview, you may have to grapple with the question where someone says, why do you want to apply your doctoral experience in this role? And we'll get to a little bit of that tomorrow in our workshops. But in most cases, I think it's a benefit to have that listed. Having your phone, your email, and you don't really need an address anymore, just city and state. No one's going to be writing letters to you. So city and state is just the easiest way of getting that across. And also, you don't need to say the word phone or email, right? You just need the actual number and the email, because everyone knows what it is. If you want your LinkedIn profile, that's great. Just make sure your LinkedIn profile supports your narrative and isn't totally distinct from that. So you may want to work on that separately and make sure that is updated, so that when you do link your LinkedIn URL to your resume, that it says more. It says it's additive to the narrative that you're creating. If you do include your LinkedIn URL, make sure you customize it, right? So if you haven't customized your LinkedIn URL, it will look something like this, where it's just your name followed by a random string of letters and numbers. You can update your profile on LinkedIn and customize it so it's a much tidier URL. So I highly recommend that. Education section is important because in the academic CV, this takes up a lot of space and covers a lot of information, right? Your dissertation, your advisor, your thesis committee, when you got your exams, or when you passed your exams, and when you submitted your thesis, and all sorts of stuff that is sort of meaningful in an academic setting, but isn't that meaningful beyond that in many cases. Strategically name dropping can be helpful, right? So if your advisors or your thesis committee are well-known people in the field and well-known people outside of the academic field, then obviously listing a connection with them probably is more beneficial than not listing them at all. If they're not relevant to fields that are out there, then to a certain extent, what you're doing by listing them is giving away some of your power to these people, right? You've done all this great work as part of your doctoral program, and then you're listing all these people, and it sort of dilutes then the impact that you've had, because all these people it sort of looks like they were supporting you in this, which they were to a small bit, and sometimes they were getting in the way in a small bit. But if they're not known outside the field, probably just removing them makes a cleaner narrative in terms of what that can look like. So we can take all of this information and basically boil it down to this. And it says the same thing, right? It says the same information in terms of what you want to get across, because the things that you've done as a doctoral student can be put into the experience section and really expanded on. So you don't need to go into a lot of this information here, because it's just not relevant to your audience in the way that it is in an academic setting. Now, relevant courses seem far, far away, if you're a postdoc or even if you're, near the end of your doctoral program, but they are important in a resume because they do generate keywords, right? So if you've taken a course in a wide range of topics as part of your graduate, experience, these courses may not be related to your thesis or your dissertation. You may not be spending a lot of time doing that, but you have knowledge of those areas. And so if you list relevant courses, you're illustrating to the reader that you have knowledge, that you have intersection with these topics, and broader knowledge is going to be more transferable to roles outside of academia than very, very focused knowledge on one subset of your field that you've been doing your research on. So it's okay to include those, and it's okay to adapt those for different jobs. What is relevant for one job may not be relevant for another. Keywords are important because in most cases, large organizations and even smaller ones are using applicant tracking software that at some point in the process, matches the keywords in your application to keywords in the job description and sees how well those match. And if there's a low match between those keywords, your materials may not get passed on to a human. No one actually may take the time to read it because the software basically says, I don't think this person has the skills that the job seems to require. So the more keywords you can get in to match what's in the job description, the better the odds that someone will read this and really be able to appreciate the skills, experiences, knowledge that you bring to the role. Work experience versus relevant experience. So this is what I commonly see on academic CVs, or at least the first draft of a resume that's being taken from an academic CV, is that people have their research and their education, and there's information in there, and then they get to this, I need a work experience section. And what they define as work experience are often things that you are paid to do, right? So there's a payment there. And so, you may be a PhD, but the first experience that I see or a doctoral student, the first experience I see under work experience is a teaching assistant, right? You may be applying for a research analyst position, but the first experience I see under work experience is a teaching assistant, which isn't really going to match in the same way. So you don't really need to define things by whether they're volunteer, by whether they're paid, by whether they're academic. What you need to define things by is how relevant the skills are in this experience. There are relevant skills from being a TA. There are relevant skills from being a doctoral student doing your own research. There are relevant skills from being a member of a student or a postdoc group on campus. And if they're relevant to the role that you're applying for, then it's better to bring them all together than to have them in these multiple distinct sections where there's academic research and professional skills and work experience and volunteer experience and leadership experience. Because if you have too many sections, you become too fragmented and it's hard for people to sort of piece you back together and really understand who you are and what that looks like. So we can take the work experience and really, here's a good example of that actually. So again, the PhD is mentioned here from this resume, and then work history starts off with being an instructor. Whereas really the thing that is most valuable in many cases about your experience is what you've done as a doctoral student or a postdoc, right? That is really wants to be centered around the narrative in your resume, so that those skills, your research skills, your analysis skills, your communication skills, your problem solving skills, your innovation skills are really all brought together. Being an instructor was great. It gave you money that you needed, great communication skills, but probably not the most impactful experience that you've had. It's sort of icing on the cake, as it were, to some of the great stuff that you've done as a doctoral student or a postdoc. So if we change this idea to sort of relevant experience, as I said, you can bring together different experiences from different areas. So you may list under the education section, you as a PhD, so it'll be PhD in your subject at Penn, graduated at this year, or expected graduation. And then under the relevant experience section, you're going to echo that by having your job, as it were, being a PhD student or a postdoc, right? So it may feel duplicative, but the reason that they are different is because in the education, that identifies the degree that you're getting, not what you're doing, well, not what you've done with that degree. Whereas in the experience, you're illustrating the skills that you're using to get the degree, or skills that you use to get the degree, or to do your postdoc, right? So the experience section becomes a much more dynamic representation of all the skills that went into you being a PhD or a doctoral student. And that's not just your dissertation. That can be any project that you've touched as part of your 3 to 5 to 7 years as a doctoral student, right? So you can really think about and be creative about different skills that you want to bring to the forefront, because you may have had side projects. You may have collaborated with other people's research as a PhD or a doctoral student. And so you get to include that under the relevant experience. It doesn't always have to be about your dissertation. That's just one part of this process. And here is again, if you're a member of the Penn Data Science group and you did some competitions or data science competitions, or you created some programs, that might be relevant to the role that you're applying for, in which case being a member of a student or postdoc group is just as valuable as the PhD because it demonstrates skills that are transferable in that way. Which takes us to this idea of describing what you did or describing the skills that you used to do them. Again, when I see, and this is actually, I see this a lot in academic CVs as well, right? There's a teaching experience section, people say I'm a TA, and then these are the descriptions that they provide. I graded exams and I held office hours. Now, if you are going to go into a teaching role moving forward, then both of these things are valid, but they're not very descriptive or they're not very engaging, right? I've held office hours before where no one has turned up at all. And I've sat there for 2 hours and I've twiddled my thumbs. And so when I see held office hours, that's what I picture, right? And that's very distinct from what other people have experienced, but I'm only experiencing it through my perception. And so I picture empty rooms and me twiddling my thumbs. So in order to stop me from inserting my own narrative, you have to be a little bit more descriptive. If you want to describe these things, then you could be a little bit more more descriptive, illustrate, more tangible. This becomes more believable. I can now begin to picture some of the things that you're doing. You can expand on that even more, right? You can talk about subject areas or disciplines. You can add quantifiable elements into it that make it seem real. All of this is, again, about holding office hours and grading exams. But the key question remains is, what is actually the takeaway that you would want the reader to have, right? What is the skill that you want them to know that this represents? Because that's the aspect of the resume that's so important, is making sure that the reader takes away, first of all, what you want them to take away, and also takes away what they need to see in order to say, this is a candidate we'd love to interview. So just describing the process of grading exams and holding office hours may not be the best way to approach, for example, being a teaching assistant for a role that isn't teaching relevant. These are all tasks that happen when you teach. But a lot of these are firmly rooted in the realm of teaching environments. If you're not teaching, then preparing a syllabus isn't helpful, right? Because syllabuses are specific to the teaching environment. So what we have to do with sort of a subject like this is expand our understanding of the skills that were used to do that, right? So these are illustrations of some of the skills that come about from doing all these tasks, right? So preparing a syllabus means doing background research. It means creating a strategy for how students are going to learn. It means writing basically a report that you are creating that gets approved in order to do that. And so, the way that you describe your teaching can really differ depending on the skills that you want to highlight and bring to the forefront. And those skills obviously have to connect to the role that you're applying to. But just telling people what you did is less helpful than illustrating the skills used to do that. And that's the same when it comes to your research too, right? So the tasks are context. You can say that you developed a strategy for communicating with students to engage them in learning by creating 2 syllabi, right? So you can integrate the actual task into the statement, but that's context for a skill. You wouldn't want to say develop syllabi to help teach students and communicate whatever it was, because that puts the emphasis on developing syllabi, right? And if that's not part of the job description, then someone says, well, that doesn't look like something I need, right? That's great, you did that, but we don't need that. Same is true with research, right? So describing your research, sometimes, the research that you may be doing, a STEM example, focuses on something very specific, ET 743, and most people won't know what it is. I don't know what that is. But you can take complicated research and you can break it down into some skills. Now, the examples I've given here are very generic, very general, because without knowing what the actual job description might be, it's hard to come up with examples that feel meaningful. But hopefully you can see that you can transform a complex research narrative into skills: collaborated, managed, designed, published, presented, right? Those are the tangible skills that come from that research description. And each of those can be transferable in a wide variety of different settings. Here's another one: genetic analysis of mutations causing hormone-independent things. Again, independently conducted, planned and implemented, authored or co-authored, right? So there's very tangible things that come from that. And so any job that you're applying to, you'll have to ask yourself, what can I do with this research description that I commonly use as I'm talking about my research to bring the skills to the forefront? How can I describe some of those things? And if that's hard for you, that's okay. It's not easy to create new narratives when you've been focused on a single narrative for a long time. Come to Career Services, schedule an appointment with us, and we can help you sort of just talk through some of the ways that you might think about your research or some of the skills that you might use to do that. And in fact, if you chat with some of your peers and say, how do you see me doing my work? How do you envision my skills? Sometimes they can bring to the forefront skills that you don't think about because you're just doing the work, but they see you doing the work. And by seeing you do the work, they can see how skilled you are at doing it, right? So some peer-to-peer chatting can be really helpful. When you are framing then some of the descriptions in the resume, structuring your bullet points, which are going to be the main part of the resume, right? So under the experience section, for each role that you have or each job that you have, you're going to have bullet points that describe the skills that you bring to the role. Bullet points, there's nothing magic about them. It just makes it easy for the reader to really pinpoint the skills that they're looking for. So if I look at a resume and I see bullet points, I know that if I scan down quickly, I should be able to see all the skills that hopefully I'm looking for right next to those bullet points, right? So when you're creating a bullet point, the first few words should be the skill that you're highlighting. That should be the skill that you want the reader to take away. And that should be the skill that is relevant to the role that you're applying to. So skill, context, outcome really just creates a structure in terms of how you're creating these narratives. The skill is the thing that you're doing. The context is where you're doing it or how you're doing it to a certain extent. And then the outcome relates back to the skill. So, led a team is a skill, leadership, but it doesn't really describe any context. Led a team as part of a consulting competition to highlight new startups, provide some context, right? And that context may be relevant to the role that you're applying to. It may not be, but so if it's not relevant, you sort of keep it short. If it is relevant, you can expand on it. Led a team to evaluate startups, as part of a consulting club that resulted in a second place prize, right? The second place prize then becomes the outcome that illustrates how effective your leadership is, right? So the outcome should be connected back to the skill that sort of begins that begins that bullet point. Not everything will have an outcome, right? And sometimes the outcomes are not the end of the project, right? So you might say, independently oversaw a research that resulted in 2 publications. Those publications are fantastic outcomes of the project, but you might also say oversaw, 2 independent projects and developed successful new collaborations with 2 labs worldwide, right? And those collaborations are also outcomes, not necessarily of the project itself, but of the skills that you used within that project setting. So as you think about some of the skills that you have or the experiences that you have, this provides a little bit of context or a little bit of structure to how to do that. What I look for when I review resumes is bullet points that are half a line long, 6 to 8 words long, because usually that means that the reader has more of an idea, or sort of the writer has more of an idea of what that should represent than the reader does. Because as the reader, I only have the words on the page. Right? I don't have your experience. I don't have insight into the thing that you're describing. As the writer, when you write a bullet point, your brain does this very helpful but yet unhelpful thing where it adds context to the experience. So you say, oh yeah, I assisted with project logistics and analysis. And what you're picturing in your mind is all the things that you did and all the skills that you used. And your brain is saying, yes, it all makes total sense. I understand what you're doing because your brain was there with you. As the reader, I only have those 6 words, right? And since I wasn't there with you, I can't picture anything. The goal of the resume is to really make a very clear image in the mind of the reader of your skills in action. The clearer the image in their mind, the easier it is for them to superimpose that onto the role that they're trying to fill, right? The murkier that image or the blurrier, if that's a word, the image in their mind because of this, this type of not descriptive illustrations, if the image is blurry, it's hard for them to picture you in that role because they don't have all the details. Now, they may want to interview you to find out, or they just may not want to interview you because they decide that, this doesn't really speak to the nature of the role in particular. So again, just some examples, right? So if the job description asks for strong communication skills, then this top one touches on ways that happen, right? I coordinated between multiple teams and we stuck with our deadlines. If it's about overcoming problems is what they're looking for in the job description, then, a very specific example may be fine, but it illustrates that I identified this and then successfully advocated for a change, right? So problem solving without advocation doesn't necessarily work so well, because you need to be able to make sure that your recommendations are enacted. And then juggle multiple priorities. This last one talks about sort of quantifying what that looks like over a time period. So it's very clear in the mind of the reader what this is. If you just say, oh yes, I can juggle multiple priorities, that's not going to be as meaningful, because what does it actually mean? But if you provide some quantifiable aspects and some timeframes, it becomes very clear. There's nothing else I need from this description to understand what you've done. And it gives me all the information I need so my brain doesn't have to sort of create new narratives for you. Now, the great thing about these bullet points is that you can prioritize different skills just by rearranging the bullet points itself, right? In most cases, a bullet point, it should be a one skill per bullet point approach. So you break up a project into the different skills that you use to do them. This is an example of one that has sort of a primary skill and a secondary skill, depending on what you want the reader to take away. So collaborated with 4 students from 3 academic disciplines to develop a more effective way to scrape data from government databases. So as the first word is collaborated, that is the primary skill. The scraping data, using databases, those are secondary skills. But I put most emphasis here on the collaboration. If I wanted to shift that around, this is the same experience, but now I'm focusing on the technical skills, right? Use Python to develop an algorithm to scrape data on climate from government databases as part of a 4-person team, right? So the emphasis is shift. So from the reader's perspective, the main takeaway here becomes the technical skills, but the collaboration is part of the narrative still. It's just secondary to them. And then the final one, use government databases to identify data on climate change that we scraped using this thing. So if you're applying for a federal job or a job where that they need experience with federal databases, then this would be a better description of that experience, because it forefronts the most relevant skill potentially for this made-up role. We have a video on the Career Services YouTube channel. I'll stick that again in the chat here so that you have that, on tailoring resume bullet points for specific job ads. So you might want to take a quick look at that. It's a short 15-minute video that you can take a look at, just to give you sort of more idea about what that looks like in terms of a process. Simplify, right? So we've already seen that the academic CV, the education section, is always, is already complicated, and our goal is to try to simplify that down. The same is true with some of the experiences that you have as a doctoral student or as a postdoc. I've seen many, especially in the STEM fields, where you do rotations in different labs. The PhD is spread over 5 different sections. This is my dissertation, here's my lab rotation, my lab rotation here, my lab rotation there. This is meaningful to you because you experience every one of these steps, but you also have to ask yourself, is it helpful for the reader? Do they care that I've been in different labs? Now, if you're going into a field where knowledge of the subjects that you gain from different labs is important, then you might be able to keep a structure like this just to illustrate that you have this multidisciplinary background. But you could also just summarize it to a certain extent and say that you gain knowledge of 5 different research areas by rotating through 5 labs, right? So you could take what would be sort of 6, 7, 8 lines here with the spaces and turn it into a single bullet point that you might have in your experience section. So rather than having dissertation and rotations be separate, they may all fall under you as a doctoral student or PhD student or a postdoc, right? So you can simplify depending on what your audience cares most about. And I think that's the important thing. It's not about your experience as much as it is about making it meaningful to your audience. So just an example from a research setting on how to simplify. The same is true for teaching, right? So you may have been an instructor or a TA for a gazillion different classes out there, and you can list them all by subject area. And this was in summer of 2019, this was in spring of 2020. None of that really matters necessarily. It doesn't really matter when you were a TA, what month or what semester. That's not necessarily important. What you did as part of being a TA, or the courses or the knowledge that you gained or that you used or what you taught, those can be important. So you could take some of these things and break it down into a much more tangible element. And then again, you can summarize that, right? Use knowledge of molecular biology to teach in 5 separate courses. Takes, again, 8 lines of text into one. Now, if you're a TA and an instructor and there are different categories, you might still need to split them up, but you still have to ask yourself, is this relevant to the role that I'm applying for? I think teaching is really relevant from a communication perspective. So that can be a key element, a key reason to include it in your resume. you probably wouldn't want a teaching experience section, right? Because that sort of frames this experience back within the realms of academia, which is what you're trying to make sure that your skills are not stuck in. You're trying to make sure that they are transferable. But certainly you can integrate your teaching into relevant experience where communication was deemed to be a skill that you're, the job that you're applying for was looking for. The job description is key, right? So the job description really guides how you prioritize talking about your experiences. The job description tells you what you will be doing in the job, tells you what they do need from you in terms of skills, and it explains why you would like to work at that organization. So if we take an example, this is a director of DEI in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. In the beginning part of the job description, they provide sort of a broad overview of some of the things that they're looking for, not specific roles necessarily, but just sort of a sense of what the position is, and what they're looking for is someone who's dynamic, someone who's an educator, a trainer, a strategist and speaker, someone who can work in a new office. So comfort, in a new office or setting up a new lab, that's something that your resume could reflect, for example. So each of these things could be skills or things that you highlight, right? Being an educator, that might be easy. Being a trainer, you could train people in your lab or in your department. Being a strategist, you're developing a strategy for your research. Being a speaker, you've spoken in academic events at conferences or other types of things, right? So you can begin to pull out these keywords and make them come to life in your resume. Here are some of the roles that you'll be doing in this role if you're applying for it, right? So these are much more specific then in terms of skills that you want to highlight. Lead and coordinate training and education, right? So your TA in this case would be extremely valuable. Formulate strategies and tactics. Now, you may not think of your doctoral degree or postdoc as strategic, but it is. You have to plan these things out. So you need to use different language to describe some of that. Mentoring here is valued. Working as a change agent. That may be harder to get across in a resume, might be better in a cover letter, but being a change agent means that you've identified a thing that needs to be changed and you've advocated for it, right? So if you in a resume talk about advocating for a change, then you're working as a change agent, right? And that could come from a student group or a postdoc group that you're working with, where you're advocating for change with your school or your administrators that are connected with that. And then they have the qualifications, the things that they need from you. And this is where they get very specific in terms of, we need a demonstration of X, Y, and Z. So, making sure that where they say demonstrated, make sure that you have actually demonstrated what that looks like in your resume is so important, right? Because demonstrated isn't just saying, oh yes, I can build new relationships. It's saying, here's how I built the relationship. Here's, this is what it looks like. Built relationship with these people to do this thing. So demonstrated is a very good sort of flag word to keep an eye out, because those are things that you really want to make come to life in your resume. If you're in the social sciences and the humanities, in the Imagine PhD platform, they've taken up for their 15 different job families, they've taken job descriptions and they've illustrated or they've annotated those job descriptions with things that you should be aware of. And then they provided a sample resume and cover letter that illustrates what that looks like. So this is just a screenshot, you don't have to read it, but it illustrates on the left is a job description, they've annotated that, and then in the resume and in the cover letter, they've highlighted approaches that this person has taken to sort of communicate those value-added things. So even if you're not in the social sciences or humanities, this is a good way of really looking at ways that people have done this effectively. And the link to Imagine PhD is in the links that I just shared. We also have a tool called Targeted Resume, which is a great tool for scanning a job description for keywords and then scanning your draft resume for keywords and seeing what that match is. And if it's 20% match, then there's work to do to try to make sure that you're using the right keywords. And if it's an 80% match, then you're doing a fine job. And if it's somewhere in between, then you're probably still doing a fine job, but there's a few things that you can tweak to get there. So again, this is a video that you can take a look at. Link is going to be in the resources that I shared in the chat. We've talked about networking so much already this week. We can't get away from that in this case. But if you're writing a resume, most of the time shouldn't actually be spent writing it. It should be spent gathering information about career fields, speaking with people in those career fields. By having conversations with those people, it will make writing your resume so much easier, right? So back to LinkedIn, back to the alumni group on LinkedIn, and all of these people, all of these alumni have insights into their careers that they may be willing to share with you. And by listening to them describe their roles, listening to the language that they use, you can take that information and say, well, how can I use similar language to describe my experience in my narrative, in my resume, right? So yes, I appreciate we really do lean into networking as a key element, but it does help so much, right? I haven't had all these jobs, so I can't give you that exact language. I can only use my secondhand knowledge of that, but these people are in the roles, some of which that you would like to be in, and so they can really speak to that. So these informational interviews, so helpful. Our link to the guide, information interviewing guide, is in the chat as well. And one of the questions, we had a whole session on this sort of yesterday, but one of the questions that you want to ask are, what are some of the skills that are most valuable to you in your role? And then listen to them describe those skills and say to yourself, do I have those skills? And the answer will probably be yes, some of them. And if you do, make sure then that you can build those into your narrative. And if you don't have those skills, that's okay. You don't have to have all the skills to apply for a role, but it also may give you a plan to say, well, maybe I can build those skills, or maybe I can find those skills so that in a future version of my resume, I can highlight those elements. So again, by listening to people, you are able to gain access to the language that they're using. By talking to people, you're able to practice using your version of that language to see if it resonates with them, right? To see if they get excited about your skills, because you're just practicing talking about your experiences in the language that you've been reading about. And because these aren't actual interviews for jobs, it's a very safe space to do that in a networking scenario. And then finally, connecting with career services. After spending 5+ years looking at your academic CV and then 100 hours trying to work your resume, your brain turns off. It gets bored of reading the same bits of information over and over again. It's saying, I know this already. I'm stuck in your head. I've been with you all the way. I don't want to read this. And I often share this slide because I think it's interesting, right? If you can make sense of this, it's because your brain is doing a lot of the hard work for you. And so if you imagine looking at your resume and trying to be critical, positively critical about it, or looking for errors or formatting issues, you're just not going to see it after a while because your brain knows what you wanted to say, or your brain knows what you wanted to get across. And so it's like, it's all right, trust me, it's fine. But it's because your brain is smart enough to make this make sense, even though it's total gibberish. We have appointments all through the summer. We have limited availability sometimes because we're away at conferences and things like that, but you can always look for same-day advising. These are virtual drop-in sessions for 15 minutes. So if you need a quick review of a resume because you need to get it out there, then these same-day advising appointments can be a great way of doing that. As always, finishing up with some resources. So on the Career Services website, we have a prepare application materials page. We have the faculty job materials as well as resume materials that you can take a look at there. 10 ways to improve your resume is a video I did for another one of these series. So you can take a look at that. I like 10 things to do, obviously. The Aurora platform, custom made for doctoral students and postdocs, has a great section on, under the professional career section, on putting together resumes, modify your resume, writing a cover letter, growing your network, because all those three things are connected. So do take a look at the Aurora platform. That's going to be helpful. We talked about Imagine PhD and the samples that they have. We can look at the annotated job descriptions. That's going to be helpful too. The Vault resume guides, they're fairly, they're generic in terms of they're not focused on graduate students and postdocs, but it just gives you an illustration of the fact that people have different advice, and that's okay, and they can look different, and that's okay, but your message, what you want to get across to your audience, that's the most important thing. How it looks, how you do that, you can get away with a wide range of approaches, but getting your message right is key. Our big interview platform has a whole resume curriculum, a video curriculum that you can read through, watch through, listen to. So that's a great tool. Big Interview is also our interview prep platform. And then don't forget LinkedIn Learning. As Penn students and postdocs, I think you all have access to LinkedIn Learning. And there's 343 results for a resume out there of different courses, different things that you can do. So leverage that, because once you leave Penn, you don't get access to the free LinkedIn Learning